when you're praying, do you ever feel like your prayers aren't going anywhere? It feels like you're talking to God, but He's not talking back to you. That's going to be part of our discussion today on Living the Message. As well, we're going to be talking about some big surprises that the Lord's Prayer gives us as we end this 6-week series through the Lord's Prayer. Join us for this very important conversation. Hey, this is Living the Message, where we discuss how the message of Christ might dwell among us richly. I'm Pastor Eric Targe, and I'm here with Senior Pastor of the Moody Church, Philip Miller. Hey, Philip.
Hey, Eric. How are you this morning?
I'm doing well. We
Awesome.
finally finished going through the Lord's Prayer.
Yeah, they said it was never going to happen, but we did it. We did it.
We did it. 6 weeks, kind of just like
weeks.
one little verse at a time, which is not something typically we do. I think we normally kind of take big passages, see kind of the whole thing, but it's been good to like really examine the intricacies of this passage. However, I think one of the things that people can get lost in, it happens when you do that, when you kind of go verse to verse, is you can totally miss the forest for the trees.
Yep.
And I think today, what I was hoping we would do is we would kind of take a step back from everything that we've looked at, having kind of known all the intricacies of the passage. Let's kind of see the big picture. What should we be able to take away from this text?
That's really good. That's a great idea. And I sometimes I think about when we're preaching, I think about what like a gearbox, like those old-fashioned manual transmissions in the cars, right?
Oh, yeah.
And you had to select the gear, and like low. In this case, like we went low and slow. We just, lots of horsepower, but just low speed.
Yeah.
And go slow to time. And other times you gear up and you go over faster, further and bigger chunks. And so, this is a good practice to zoom in, zoom out, see the thing as a whole. Let's do it.
Our car buffs loved that analogy. So how about this? Would you be willing just to read that quick for us? Let's kind of go through it and have that kind of as our guideposts.
Sure.
But if you'd read the Lord's Prayer for us real quick, then we'll hop into some takeaways that we've gotten from this.
Yeah. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we have also forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen.
Amen. Amen. What a phenomenal prayer. As I think back on this series, I think one of the things that you've brought up multiple times over these past 6 weeks is that idea of the Father's heart. And I think that's so helpful for us to be reminded of that God is already on your side. That he's up close. He's our Father. Because I think a lot of people have that tendency to think prayer is me trying to get to heaven, as opposed to the other way around. But I wanted to just stop, because that phrase, our Father, can be really hard for people to personalize. What would you recommend for people? How can they live that our Father when God feels incredibly distant?
Yeah. Well, so it is a radical breakthrough, what Jesus is saying. He's the first person to pray to God as Father. And he's saying, you do it too. And I think this is really radical, Eric, because I think in our normal approach to prayer is often we think, how do I get God to hear me?
Yeah.
We assume he's not interested. He's busy. He's got a big world to deal with, huge family, got a million things. We assume he's like us, right? That he, he's probably busy. He's too important. Like I would never bother to try to get an audience with the president, because who am I, right? He's got a million things going on. Like I'm not going to bug him.
He's got more important people.
And I don't want to be rejected, so I don't even try, right? So I think there's a lot of that when it comes to God. We just kind of assume, well, he's busy. He's got a lot of things going on. I'm probably a nobody to him.
Yeah.
And so why would I even try? I don't want to be rejected. And but what Jesus is saying is, like, we get to come to him just like he gets to come to his Father. That this is the message of the gospel, that Jesus has come. We have to read this in light of all of what Jesus is going to come and do when he dies in our place and for our sake and bears our sin and reconciles us to the Father so that we are children of God. That's what he's here to do. And this prayer is situated within that work of Jesus, right? So we're reading it that way, and we understand that what Jesus has come to do is to make it possible for us to be children of God, sons and
Yeah.
daughters, which means we have all the rights and privileges of a child of God, which means we can just go to him anytime we want. And he's motivated and inclined to listen and hear. And so I bring all kinds of baggage to this relationship where I'm bringing assumptions about God's character and about God's capacity and about his will and goodness and interest in me. And I'm making assumptions there, right?
Yeah.
And as I bring all of those things to the table, I have to recognize the gospel is teaching me a different mode, a different way of relating to God. Like Jesus is retooling my whole fabric and framework of how to relate to God.
Yeah.
And so it really is a challenge to our hearts to really dare to believe that God actually is inclined to listen, that he wants to hear from us, that he longs to hear from us, that if we simply ask, he's inclined to say yes, and that he already knows what we need before we ask. And so to me, this is just a really paradigm shifting way of thinking about prayer, because it means that God's eager to hear from me. And so if I'm not praying, it's probably because I've brought all this baggage to it, and I'm not actually attending to the real heart of God in Jesus Christ that is now mine. Through what Jesus has done.
So let's
That's
dig
huge.
into that our heart issue, because I think that's where I think there's a lot of people that I know of, and I know there's a lot of people that don't pray. So I don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill here, but I know that there's quite a few people I meet with on a regular basis who say, "Yeah, I pray every day, but it kind of feels like my prayers are just hitting a glass ceiling and popping back down." Right? It feels like I don't feel anything. The Our Father moment just kind of feels like I'm saying Our Father, I'm calling out to him, but I don't get anything. What would you say to those people who are saying, I want to feel what Jesus felt?
Yeah.
What should they do about that?
Well, we got to remember, Jesus doesn't always feel 100% close to God either, right? He felt forsaken on the cross. So there are times when Jesus feels frustrated by prayers not being immediately answered or whatever. So I would say that, first of all, maybe there's a bad assumption there that it ought to just feel like like I'm just cuddling, I can understand that. But here's the other thing, is to recognize there's a million ways that God is reaching out to communicate back to us. Through his word, through creation. When my kids make artwork and they give it to me, and it's terrible artwork, right? I mean, they're getting better as they get older, but it's like
Miller kids, don't listen to this
you
podcast.
You wouldn't go frame this and put it in the museum, right? But I love it and I cherish it and I put it on my fridge and why do I do that? Because it's love, it's relationship, it's that beauty is intended to communicate their hearts. And I've learned, this is just a little thing for me, but I look at sunrises and sunsets and I wonder, what must God be like if he's painting the sky like this? What is he trying to communicate? Whether I'm awake to see it or not, or whether I pause to notice it, he's painting glory across the sky. And I think he's trying to say, I love you. I love you, right? And so to see a sunrise or sunset and say, I love you too. There's a little bit of retraining that we have to do of this is not random beauty. It's purposeful. It's intended to communicate a message. Everyday grace is dripping into our lives through common grace, through the world around us, through the scriptures. And so when we feel, when we encounter those moments of glory and beauty, it really is God reaching back to us. And so I think asking God, help me to see you today. Help me to notice the grace that you're pouring into my life. Would you show yourself in some way? And then watch for it. I think he loves to answer those prayers, but it's probably going to come in a little different way than we were expecting. But we can find God in a lot of unexpected places. And so that would be, I would say, ask God. If someone would come to me and say, hey, I'm trying to pray, but I just don't feel this closeness, I would ask him. I'd tell him, I don't feel it sometimes, and I'd love to feel more. Would you show yourself to me in a way that I'll know it's you?
Well, I love that because I feel like there's three things I'm just taking away from that. One, the ask God, be honest with Him. Hey, I'm not feeling it. I want to feel it. Secondly, the understanding of retuning our minds. I love that, of looking at the sunset, being willing to say, you know what, God, you're speaking to me through all creation. You're speaking me through your word. Having that. But I think probably one of the most liberating things you said that can be so helpful for so many of the people that I know I speak with and people that are listening to this podcast is that you're not spiritually immature necessarily if you're not feeling it.
Right.
Jesus didn't always feel it.
Right.
And I don't think that's something I've even really thought about very much in regards to like, Jesus had times where he was like, why aren't you answering me? Right? Like, why have you forsaken me? Like, Jesus had times where he felt like his prayer was bouncing down. And he is the most spiritually mature human to ever live.
Absolutely. No question.
And so it's part of our broken humanity that we live in.
Well, and part of the reality is, we live outside the garden.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, so there was a time when there was that kind of relational closeness, and then ever since then, we've been separated. And now it's coming back. The veil is torn. Yeah. Christ has made a way back, but the kingdom, heaven has not come down to earth yet, right? Yeah. So that the merging is coming, and it'll be a lot. But there's a reason we're waiting for heaven and waiting for new heavens, new earth, and the recreation of the universe. We don't live there yet. So we're in the already, not yet, in the tension. We experience some measure of that closeness, and there's more to come. Yeah. It's like a long distance dating relationship, right? I mean, it's just, it's like we're together and we're committed, and yet it's hard because we're not in the same space yet, right? And that's where cosmically everything's eventually moving toward this wedding, right? And we get Jesus forever, and so there's a lot to look forward to relationally in terms of closeness, but there's a lot to remember and hold on to in the meantime. Right?
Yeah.
And just like in a relationship, if you're feeling disconnection, you would go read letters or look at gifts or things to kind of re-anchor and say, yeah, no, this is still real. I'm still loved. This is still, you know what I mean? And for us, that's the Word of God. And that's all the beauty that He's layering into our lives through creation. So it's the same habits of running to those anchor points of no, this is what's real. Because our hearts will wander, and we're fickle, and we tend to lose hope and faith, and so this brings us back.
That's such a good word. Such a good word. So one of the first things we said, the big first surprise of the Lord's Prayer, is that He's already close to us. Like, God is close to us. He wants to hear us. We don't need to try and enter some transcendent type thing. It's like, hey, this is the beauty of what Christ.
He came all the way here for us.
Into. But there's a second thing that I thought was really interesting as well. Is that it's really regarding the way that prayer works. Because I think a lot of people tend to focus on the idea of prayer being all about, okay, hey, how can I change the world around me? But one of the things that I think you brought out was that, no, the Lord's Prayer is primarily about changing you, which is just really, it's a very different way of thinking about prayer. And so I'm curious, how does someone who's saying like, hey, listen, I'm really praying for this thing, I want this thing to happen, how do they live with that balance of praying for something, but also just saying like, hey, but I need you to change my heart? Because there's a fear that it can become a weak prayer.
Yeah, I do think there's a counterintuitive to this whole prayer thing, right? I mean, I think a lot of us think of prayer as like, okay, this is a tool I've got to try to fix the universe and make things out there that are bothering me, or I
think prayer is often an instrumental tool.
That's right. Yeah. I want this. I don't have it. I have this, I don't want it, so either get it away from me or give me something. In other words, we so often use prayer as a way of trying to control and order the world around us, and we think, well, God's got a lot of power and He'll help me, and if I can just leverage this, I can get things to be the way I want them to be in life. And what we are finding in the Lord's Prayer is God invites us to pray very boldly about all those things, right? This is what I'm asking for, God. Be assertive about it. And yet there is also this deeper thing that's happening in me as I'm releasing and surrendering and, being more flexible and not my will but yours be done. And so there's stuff that I'm yielding in the process of the prayer itself.
Yeah.
And so it's not just the world that's being influenced, but I'm actually changing as I pray, which I think is counterintuitive, because most of the time we think, I'll pray to try to change the world, and at least half, maybe more, of what prayer is actually doing is working on us.
Yeah.
And I do think that's counterintuitive. But if you think about it, Eric, there's a whole lot of misery in life that comes from our inability to control the things around us, right? There's things we want and we don't have, and so we get angry, and we try to manipulate and control or get coercive or like bargain and try to find a way to get that thing. Or there's things that we have and we don't want, and we can't accept the realities of what we're facing or our limitations or disease or things that are like hard and like, but we don't want to accept them. We're grieving through it and we're bargaining and angry and, depressed and like, all the grief cycle. And then, but like, there's a lot of misery in life that just comes from trying to control things we can't control, have things we can't have, get rid of things we can't get rid of. Like there's a whole lot of misery in my life, just Philip Miller's life, around stuff like that I at the end of the day, I need to release, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the whole like serenity prayer thing of like, give me the grace to know what I can't change, right? And like release it. And I see so much of this in the Lord's Prayer of like, yes, bring your needs, bring your sin for forgiveness, bring your struggles and trials and pray for deliverance through them. But it's all framed out with remember what's going on in the universe and the glory that God is winning for his name and the kingdom that's coming and his power that will rule over all, and that this world is broken and there's, we're not home yet. And there's just so much of this like surrendering of like, okay, not my will, but yours be done, yielding, surrendering, like that. And actually that's where the peace comes. Yeah. And that's where I realize like I'm actually starting to change under the prayer. And it's very interesting. They've done studies. There were some nuns, it's interesting, that dedicated their bodies to science when they died, after they died. And
Catholic nuns,
yeah. And they of course, they're very prayerful and they're in monasteries and whatever. Yeah. And they studied their brains alongside just regular human brains when they died. And the brains of the nuns were dramatically different.
In what way?
In their composition. So the way the brain was wired and connected and all the synaptic was like totally different. There were sections of the brain that were... Anyway, and the researchers have concluded it has to do with their prayer life. That the prayer life, prayer actually changes our entire physiology of what's going on in our brain. Huh. And it's kind of like, like the dream state where we're processing information from one hemisphere to the other as we're dreaming at night. Prayer is kind of like that, but on an accelerated path. And it builds the strength of the connections between the hemispheres. Anyway, I'm not a neurobiologist, but I find this stuff fascinating.
That is very fascinating.
Yeah, the neuroplasticity of our brains to be able to actually shift and change like this. But what we're seeing evidence of, I think, is the fact that as we pray, we're actually processing the world differently than when we're trying to control the world and live in it and just sort of navigate it, make decisions about the world. When we actually bring the brokenness of the world and surrender it into the hands of God, there's something really beneficial that's happening that is enlivening and reconnecting and actually making us more human. And
it brings completely new meaning to that idea in Romans where it says renew your mind, right? Like you're truly renewing your mind when you pray. Yeah. Like I hadn't heard about that study, and that's just phenomenal.
Yeah, it's phenomenal stuff. And so but this whole idea of like that maybe prayer is acting on you as much as anything else, I think that's counterintuitive. Yeah. I think most people think prayer is how do I change the world? And we find out as we do it that actually prayer is changing us as much as anything else. Yeah. And it's raising our capacity level to actually engage in the real world with real things that we really can't change or control.
Yeah.
But our ability to rise into and interact with those things is far greater having actually prayed about it than if we didn't do those things.
Again, I think that's another word of such great encouragement. Like that first word of like, hey, if you're not feeling it, that's okay. Jesus didn't. But also to hear like, hey, if your world is not changing because of your prayers, that's okay too. It's not primarily, or it's not, maybe primarily isn't the right word. I don't know how we want to rank it, but it's not solely about changing the world. It is, your prayer life is about changing you.
Yeah.
It's about helping you process the world differently.
And again, we see that modeled in Jesus, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to go to the cross.
Oh yeah.
But not my will, but yours be done. So like you pray about it and the cross may not go away, but his demeanor going to the cross is beautiful.
He willingly lays down his life.
And it does change the world, but in a different way.
Yeah.
And in a better way, because God called him on this courageous path of surrendered sacrificial love. And that it felt like the thing he didn't want, but it turned out actually to his greater glory because he surrendered to it. And we have a good Father who's doing that too. And so as we surrender to these things, there may be hard things, but the way we go through life can radically change. As I pray, I find myself, I'm actually climbing up onto the table, and surgery is happening on my heart as I pray. And that, again, it's a bit surprising to us, but that's the Lord's Prayer teaches us that.
It's so good. I want to reiterate to those who are listening or watching, like, hey, we're not saying that you shouldn't feel anything when you pray. What we're saying is it's okay if you don't. But like, no, it's good. We are invited to feel the fatherhood and the childhood of us with God. And then likewise, we should pray with an expectation that our world would change. But there is a balance there of the Lord may be seeking first to change you. And that's often his primary purpose. Change your vision, change your understanding of the world around you. I think those are just such helpful things to be thinking about. And there's another thing that you brought out, I think, mostly in this last message. So in this last message, you had this phrase that I just really liked. You said the Lord's Prayer is teaching us to lose ourselves in the grandeur of God. I wrote that down because I love that phrasing, lose ourselves in the grandeur of God, and how this prayer is teaching us that there's a greater story. It's not about me, about my plans. It's a much better plan. Would you just tease that out a little bit? Because I know story is so important for you. Like you're constantly bringing up stories, whether Tolkien or Lewis or Sayers. Why is that? Why is it important to be lost in God's story? And how do we do that even?
Yeah, so I do think it's, again, one of the counterintuitives. In our culture, our American Western culture, it's all about you and the story you want to write, and you're the main character in the plot line of your life, and be the leading character, and like go be
true to yourself,
and write your own story, and you be you, and all like
my
and
truth.
Right, and there's so much beauty to that. The reason it's powerful is it's partial truth. We are made in the image of God, and we have creative genius that God has given us, and we are meant to live lives and write meaningful stories that matter, right? So that part's true. And so much of the world is like trying to get us to live into some other human being's story for their power or their agenda. And so we rightfully distinguish that and say, well, I don't want to live somebody else's story. I want to live my story. Okay, so that part's good. But what we can overcorrect on that and forget that God's story is actually the best story for all people. That what God is doing in the world is the grand story. It's the greater story. And what I think happens is when we try to write our stories by ourselves without any reference to God, we find ourselves, we don't have the gravity, the mass, the glory to actually author our own stories. We end up, it's very hard to write the kind of story that you want. So what you end up doing is then you see other stories, movies, books, and you attach to them, and you go, now there's a story, right? And you want that so badly. Well, the beautiful thing is God's given us the ultimate story. And I think fantasy and things like that really point to that ultimate story in ways that very few things can. And
So what do you mean live into God's story? Because it's a beautiful phrase. Again, I
Yeah.
told you I love that.
Yeah.
Losing ourselves in the grandeur of God. But what does that actually mean on a day-to-day basis? What does that mean for our
Yeah.
prayers? How do you live into God's story?
Yeah, well, if the story of God is the restoration of the universe, right?
Yeah.
That it was made good, it fell into disorder and chaos and sin, that Jesus came to redeem and rescue it, and that he's created a people for himself who will share in relationship with him forever and glory, and then one day he will make all things new and bring heaven down to earth, and it will be glory to the ends of the earth for all of eternity. If that's the plot line, and we wake up in that world, we wake up mid-story in this grand, beautiful thing that God's doing, authoring, right? Our lives, if we want them to count and matter, to work with the grain of that story, like to come in to alignment and say, hey, I want to be a part of that kingdom. I want to be a part of that glory. I want to be a part of that powerful restoration of the universe. And this is what's beautiful, is that God invites us in, right? Yeah. I can't believe this. It would be so much easier, more efficient for God to just take full ownership of setting the world right.
Oh, yeah.
And just do it on his own whenever he feels like it, right? But he chooses to invite us to participate in this story, right? And so we've been given this great commission: go into all the world and make disciples of all nations, right? Yeah. Baptize them and teach them, and I'll be with you, right? And we will be his witnesses everywhere we go, and so like my life matters not just for the money I can make and for the stuff I can acquire and the experiences I can sort of provide for my kids and set my kids up for success, but my life actually matters for eternity, because every person I interact with is a soul that's destined for glory, that's made for glory, right? We'll spend eternity somewhere.
Yeah.
And so my life, my interactions, the love I share, the holiness I model, all the gospel, the good news that I can invite people into and share about what Christ has done, that all of that counts for eternity. Yeah. And I get to co-conspire with the King who's been, exiled, but is coming back to take over again. And I get to get in on his agenda ahead of time as an ambassador, an emissary of the faraway King who's coming.
Yeah.
And I get to live into this new creation right now and get to be a foretaste of it. How beautiful is that? And to be a meaningful contributor. Yeah. Not just like daddy's little helper, oh, I'll let you stir the brownies. But no, God gives us incredible ownership. You go figure it out. Write a story. Live your life in such a way. You get really creative. It's your life. But you get to do it in a way that is contributing to the eternal story of what God's writing. How beautiful is that?
Well, it's this beautiful recommissioning, right? It's what Adam and Eve were called to do at
That's
first.
Right.
They were called to cultivate and keep, and the first Adam failed, and the second Adam, Jesus, succeeds, and we're called in him to be a part of that restoration. And so I think the beautiful thing there is some people can look and they can say, oh, well, restoration is only for those who preach and those who are full-time disciplers and this and that. And there's something beautiful here that says, hey, listen, as you're praying in all areas of life, as a businessman, as a janitor, as a florist, as a laundromat worker, I don't know all the jobs that there are, but in each of those areas where you can create order and keep and bring beauty.
And that idea of, the image of God that God created Adam and Eve to be his image, to spread out throughout the earth and wherever they go to represent the rule and reign of God. Of course, they blew it. But in a sense, that's what Jesus is getting us back on track. And what's amazing is to read these passages about, Jesus has purchased people for himself from every nation, tribe, and tongue to be a kingdom of priests to rule with him forever. Yeah. This language of God is going to delegate authority to all of his people over aspects of the new creation that we will have say over forever. I don't know my job's going to be useless in heaven, because everyone will know God, and I won't have to be a pastor. But like other people's jobs, like someone's going to need to trim some trees and cultivate the earth and like create, like, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, totally.
someone's going to have to look after the whales and the like how beautiful that in the end God has invited us in as collaborators
Yeah.
in the keeping and the working and the beautifying and unleashing of all the potential of glory forever. That there's purpose to that. We're not just sitting around on clouds with harps wearing dresses. Like what a terrible vision for the end,
Yeah.
right? But that we've been brought in, and we get to do that now
Yeah.
and forever. And that's, to me, this is, again, paradigm shifting stuff. The Lord's Prayer brings us into this space where we realize not only are we praying for these things, but now I'm going to go seek first this kingdom, and I'm going to go live this out, and it's a great commission.
Be on mission now.
Kingdom, glory, power to the ends of the earth as all nations come to worship God alone, and I get to be a part of that. How amazing is that?
Such a good reminder for us as we finish this series. I love it. Remember, if you don't always feel it, that's okay. Ask God to retune your heart. If you're feeling that your prayers aren't working, it might be that God is working on you. Work on that surrender. Be willing to surrender and recognize that you're being called to be involved in a bigger story than just the story that you're seeking to write for yourself. You're invited in to God's mission of restoring the universe. I think these are really helpful for our prayer lives as we really think about the purpose of our prayer that Christ helps us to pray. We hope that this was a helpful conversation for you as you've watched or listened to this. We want to encourage you to please don't forget to share this podcast on Spotify, YouTube, iTunes, wherever you're accessing it. Be sure to give us a rating. We always enjoy that, and a comment. We'd love to hear from you. We do hope that you are encouraged, equipped, and enabled to now go and live the message.